Hello, everyone. As we are still waiting for some more people to join, we are going to kick off with the Newpoint Navigator series, Understanding Limited Receivers webinar. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining. And we are going to start the webinar. Throughout the conversation today, you're going to hear from Ken Yeager, who is the CEO and founder of Newpoint Advisors, as well as special guest Richard Perna, who's a legal expert with decades of experience in loan workouts and foreclosures, and the appointment and representation of receivers and assignees. And from Newpoint also, we have Matthew Brash, who is a managing director with Newpoint and has a great expertise in limited and traditional receiverships and how to pursue one, both, or the other. Folks, today will provide you with a quick overview of limited receiverships, and then we'll transition into a little bit more of a question and answer discussion. Where we'll encourage you to share any questions that you have with us, and we'll have a little conversation between Matthew, Ken, and Richard as well. Stick around until the very end of the webinar to receive a limited receivership tip sheet that has some facts and figures about when and how to use limited receiverships. So without further ado, I'm going to pass this off to Ken Yeager, CEO and founder of Newpoint Advisors. You are muted.
This is Ken Yeager, president and founder of Newpoint Advisors Corporation. We are a company focused on small companies in distress. We have a national platform, and we've been around for 11 years, approaching now over 500 engagements in this space and with this focus. Today, I want to talk a little bit about limited receiverships, give a little primer, and then we're going to have our conversation as was mentioned. So what I'll do is I'll start a little bit with this as a definition, and then we'll build on this in our conversation. A limited receivership is a judicial process that appoints a receiver, and we talk about limited receivers, but they're called receivers, but they have limited powers, who is a fiduciary of the court and an independent third party. To take control over a business, preserving or securing certain assets and collateral, or even financial documents, reporting, maintaining financial controls, and other things that could be written about what needs to be done specifically. This targeted approach using limited receiverships is particularly beneficial for special asset groups and attorneys who are looking to preserve and protect businesses and companies in the lower middle market sector, where we find assets can disappear very quickly. Assets may need to preservation to be able to be sustainable, and companies that are just very vulnerable in the small business space. Unlike traditional receiverships, where a receiver is appointed to manage all the assets of an operation of a company, a limited receiver's role is confined to specific assets, maybe a department, possibly a business unit, but as determined by the court in the agreement between different parties that is then ultimately put into an order. A limited receivership can be initiated by various parties, such as a creditor's petition, a shareholder dispute, or a voluntary decision by a company's directors to address insolvency issues, contractual breaches, or other things. So hopefully that starts to paint a bit of a landscape about the kind of companies and the situations we're dealing with today. And we're going to talk about limited receiverships. So in starting that overview, if you will, a couple of differentiating things to point out, and then we're going to dive in with our guest. Differences that are big between a limited receivership and a, if you will, what I call a full receivership, are typically the speed at which you can get these things started, which we're going to expand upon, which also is probably the likelihood of appointment. So different powers, different controls, kind of put the parties together at the table. Last but not least, before we get to our guest, this also helps people get to the people who are stakeholders who don't have much transparency, get to the legal issues, and start working on the remedies that a limited partnership can do sooner, since the speed part. But the identification process is so incredibly important on the limited receivership, just like a full receivership. Okay, with that, we want to introduce our guest.
I'd love to introduce our guests and share with all of the folks who are attending the panel that this is a great time to use the Q&A section. So you should be able to pull that up and type in any questions that you have so we can feed them to the panel throughout. Otherwise, without further ado, we will introduce Richard Perna, who is our legal expert on today's panel and has a great deal of expertise in dealing with receiverships, supporting people through a receivership, whether it is more traditional or a limited receivership, as well as Matthew Brash, who is also an expert on when and how to use these. So Ken, Richard, and Matthew, please start a discussion to share a little bit more about when and how to use receiverships.
Awesome. Thank you so much. There are so many different ways to get to talk about a limited receivership, and there are lots of different reasons for a limited receivership and people who would want them to be in place. But for today's conversation, I'm going to take on the role of asking questions as if I am a creditor looking for transparency with a particular borrower of mine that I've got concerns over. And so with that, Matthew, I'm going to throw the first question at you, and then Richard, let you pile in, and vice versa, guys. We're just going to have our little coffee clutch here. All right. So first off, let's just talk about the timing. When's the right time to recommend a limited receivership?
Sure. Great question. Glad to be here and be on the panel with you and Richard. Some that we work with closely, and him and Richard's firm, we trust very, very much in these type of special situations. So, receiverships, to be biased, there's always a good time to put in a receiver. It's just dependent upon whether, what is the scope, what is the deliverables that you're looking from that receiver. When we get calls about receiverships, usually you're getting to a place where there isn't as much transparency, accountability. You're worried about the preservation and security of one's collateral. And receiverships, especially limited receiverships, can be both for healthy and unhealthy companies as well. But really, when we're getting down to the bare bones of things, the transparency and just the comfort of knowing that there is a independent third party appointed by the court as a fiduciary in the eyes and ears of the court, being able to account for and hold on to whether it's the money, understand and be able to display where the collateral is, what condition it's in, and be able to make decisions about what monies go out the door is critical and important to any key stakeholder, whether a lender or a partner. So I always say that if it enters your mind, it probably is a situation to start moving it forward. And as we see a lot of times, sometimes just by filing a motion to appoint a receiver, even on a limited capacity, although you have a higher likelihood of getting it through, that alone gets the attention of the other party and usually will bring him or her or them to the table for those discussions.
Go ahead, Richard.
Sure. So I've used them in a variety of situations. I've used them with lenders when we really don't want to upset the operation of the company, but we want to have a check on the inflow and outflow of the receivables. What are they being spent on? Are they using the money in the best way possible, especially in a distressed situation? And I've used many receivers as well as Newpoint to go in and do that and to actually get a hold of a good picture of the cash flow. Almost like a cash collateral order in bankruptcy, where the trustee looks at the assets and decides what's the most important things to pay. The first thing that we want to know, whether we're a lender or a creditor or a partner, is where's the money going and what is it being used for? Check the salaries, check the expenditures. Is it something they really need? And I've used Newpoint in that situation, especially in a case I have up in Lake County, to make sure that the money is going in the direction it needs to go.
Gotcha. Well, and Matthew, you alluded to this, but is it ever too? We talked about special situations versus distressed. Not every situation is a company that's going to zero, or if you will, failing. In that context, is there a timing? As a creditor, when do I want this? And relative to, let's say, not an insolvency situation, but maybe relative to just a special situation where I just don't know what's going on.
Yeah, I think, it goes back to a couple of things. One, exactly what, Richard was saying before about having that transparency and accountability of someone being in there, not necessarily in necessarily in a solvency period, but it could be a situation where even from a lender standpoint, before it gets to the workout, or if it's on the fringe of the workout, you're hearing about partnerships disputes. You're starting to get some financials or information that's coming in not as timely. There is some concerns and question marks about certain decisions that have or haven't been made. Of course, there's always the idea of other potential junior lenders and other MCAs and everything out there if the company is in a distressed situation. So really what it comes down to is we always say, like, any type of warning sign, usually you're going to go through your steps to see, okay, have a meeting with that potential borrower or those stakeholders, check off your boxes, but you don't want to get too far down to where you are being put in a situation where you're playing, instead of offense, you're not playing defense, or vice versa, really. So, in working with Richard and his firm, they've always had a very good pulse on when you need to pull those levers and what that scope and deliverable, needs to be. And I can tell you in this, few deals that we've done, several deals actually we've done with Richard and his firm, the timing is usually at the point where there is, concern that requires an immediate remedy and a third party to come in there. And like Richard was saying, that, on a limited basis, but it provides immediate results, and gets a receiver in there to be able to account for, where the monies are, where the assets are, and not exactly upset the operations of the business. So we've gotten contacted for even healthy companies that have lender relationships with loans out there that is, starting to head potentially south, and they're trying to, start stacking sandbags before they get to that point. And we have partners of those businesses with the lenders come in and say, how do we get a receiver? How do we get a third party in there? Because, my partner is running it, but we're not having, as much of the transparency as we thought we had.
Matthew, that's super helpful. So as a creditor, I'm convinced I've got the right guys in the room. We've sold you're trying to sell me on limited partnership. Richard, what is it that I'm going to give up? Being, having a limited receiver versus the full receivership, and maybe a little bit of what I gain.
Well, in some instances, what you gain is in an instance where the company may be teetering from a lender's perspective, but hasn't fully gone into an insolvency situation. It can aid you in saving the company, for lack of a better term. You're not waving the flag. The vendors and the customers aren't seeing a new face, calling them up, making contracts, discussing timing. That's still being done by management. So management is still operating the company. So from anyone on the outside, for most people on the outside, you won't even know the person's there. That's the goal. The goal isn't to sound the alarm bell, but to get the lender comfortable with what's going on in the company, or as Matt said, a partner comfortable with what's going on in the company, in the case of a shareholder dispute, and to make sure that we're going to either save the company from the lender's perspective, give some information or advice as to a good angle to take to try to save the company, and or in the shareholder dispute, possibly solve whatever the issue was by getting some transparency that wasn't normally there. Because in a lot of corporations, there's a quote unquote investor and there's an operator. And the investor really isn't there for the day-to-day, doesn't know what's going on. Issues arise, doesn't trust his partner because there's no transparency. So Newpoint, in the circumstances that we've appointed them and worked with them, is very good at keeping this civil, not going in and taking a super aggressive approach, but discussing with the operating partner in that instance, what's going on, looking at what they're doing, game planning how to make this go to the next level and how to save it. And if it's a situation where it's going to be a divorce, figuring out a good way to get there without dissolving the company or creating a bigger problem you already have. And from the lender's perspective, it's very similar. the lender can take a look at this, and the borrower and the lender can feel comfortable that they're having an open dialogue. And Newpoint is very good at that. As I said, is at not accelerating this into an insolvency situation where you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah. Matthew, anything to add to that? The limitations and the expectations?
Well, I mean, the other way of looking at too is, we talk about, and one of the things that Ken, you, me, and Richard, we talk about with our lender friends out there too is, situations in which, how can you get like a backdoor approach into the business? And sometimes, it's either through a real estate receivership, or if there is real estate involved with the business. A limited receivership also can kind of act as that reference and that tool where you have that management, as Richard was speaking, right? So that is, hey, you're still going to be in place. We're not having someone come in to basically, on their horse with their sheriff badge saying, I am in charge now. But in a way, in a limited receivership, you still kind of are, because, for a lot of these limited receiverships that we do, you're in control of the cash, you're in control of the bank accounts, all the flow of money in and out, and any decision being made of what payments are really do come through that limited receiver. And therefore you are in a way in quite a bit of control of what's going on with the business. And I think what Richard said just recently is one of the most important things about this whole process is, where in a traditional receivership, the receiver is the face. He or she is the one that's making the contract, making the calls, dealing with customers, dealing with vendors, having those communications. And that could lead to some catastrophes, perhaps. Not always, but those are situations where you're putting some risk in. On a limited receivership basis, you really are behind the scenes. You are not, face front. So it's a good way to kind of keep the status quo.
Well, I'll tell you this, if you don't mind, Ken, me jumping in here. I'll tell you this. The building that I'm in went into receivership, my office building. And the first thing that happened, they sent all the tenant a notice that they're in receivership. So then everyone's talking what's going on. Is it going into foreclosure? What's happening? And it has that negative effect. So you've got a vendor or you have a customer who's relying upon the company for deliveries in order to meet his obligations. And all of a sudden he finds out that Newpoint is taking the company over. Well, if you can't calm him down and suggest to him that his supply of materials or inventory is not going to dry up, you're going to lose a customer. In this situation, and as Matt said, a lot of times these companies are healthy. The situation I have most recently with Newpoint is a situation where, because of certain laws, it wouldn't be feasible to put a receiver in place because there's certain restrictions on the operation of the business. And in that case, we went to the limited receivership in order to watch the cash, to determine what's being spent. And of course, in a situation with a court-appointed receiver, if something's going to be spent above a certain dollar amount, Matt has to petition the court and say, hey, we want to buy a new machine. Here's how much it's going to cost. And then the judge weighs in as well as both sides. So that's the biggest part of a limited receivership in my mind, is that it increases the chances of success, is really my perspective. If it's a full-on foreclosure and you're not trying to sell the company out of bankruptcy or something or assignment, that's a different story. You're not really all that concerned about whether or not people know it's in a receivership or what the health of the business is. But it's really important in most instances where you're looking for a limited receivership that your goal is really to try to save the company and to salvage what's there, not to have the street think that the company's in trouble. And that's the biggest benefit of the limited receivership.
Great, Richard. So as we think about that, we have a question from the group in the role that Newpoint plays in helping to implement limited receiverships. So I wonder if this group could talk a little bit about the role that Newpoint plays, whether they are the consultant or the limited receiver, actually.
Well, in my instance, they're always the limited receiver.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, guys, I don't mean to speak for you, but when I've used them, they've been the ones that have taken control of the cash, dealt with all the parties. You deal with both sides, and that's always been their role, and they do it very effectively.
Great. Actually, and I appreciate you answering that question, Richard. I want to go back to something you said and unpack this a little bit, because I think it's super nuanced, but also very helpful for people trying to understand limited receiverships. Matthew, I'm going to start with you because you and I have had this conversation. Richard, I imagine you can chime in with more examples. But Matthew, we talked about those Richard mentioned contractual issues that don't allow you to take on a full receivership, because you're going to spoil something that's of value in the business by doing that. Can you unpack that for everyone? Talk a little bit about some examples of places where licenses, grants, issues rise, and limited receivership is the smarter way to go?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Currently we have a situation which actually, Richard is involved with us in this limited receivership where the majority owner of the company has a disadvantaged business enterprise certification license. And, basically what that comes down to is in a traditional receivership where the receiver is basically taking over the entire business, the operations, the financials. As we said, they're the face now basically of that business. They're sending out the notices, they're dealing with customers, contracts, bids. If that were to happen in this one receivership that I'm referring to, where the majority owner has that designation certification, that might ruin the ability of that company to go out and be able to bring in new business, because they have that lane, that avenue that utilizes that DBE, or a minority women-owned business certification, that provides them with insider ways of getting certain like state contracts, general contractor contracts. So that's one of many examples of where a limited receiver is a benefit and a tool. And as we've been saying since the beginning of this webinar series, is that it keeps kind of the status quo, but allows for there to be accountability and control in place as well.
Richard, you got some other examples?
Well, off the top of my head, and I've never done this outside of a bankruptcy, but the liquor license is a big issue. And Matt's shaking his head because as a trustee, he understands that that's another area where not anyone can just step in and start running a restaurant with a liquor license. And there's, you may get away with it for a period of time, but eventually the authority is going to look at this and say, wait a minute, you're running a business. You don't have a liquor license. We haven't done the background check, so forth and so on. But, similar to the issue with the minority is whether or not your vendor contracts are going to be affected, or your customer contracts, depending on what the default provisions are in those contracts, whether or not you being taken over by a receiver allows somebody who you have a favorable contract with to try to break that contract, using the excuse that I'm at risk. So there are a lot of things that you can do, or a lot of examples of things in there that may be affected by a full receivership that the limited doesn't really come into play. And it really, there's another issue that we haven't talked about. Cost effectively, the cost differential between a full receivership and a limited receivership is very large. You don't have somebody there 24 hours a day running the company, dealing with phone calls, dealing with customer problems. You have a very limited role, and therefore you don't spend as much money. And I think you get really what you want to get out of it, provided that it hasn't crossed the line and Matt doesn't go in there or Ken and say, oh my God, you've been stealing money for the last year. If you don't get to that point, it really gives you that ability to feel comfortable, or your client to feel comfortable that things are going in the direction they're supposed to go, without that expense.
Fantastic. Matthew, any comments on cost side of this equation and what you've witnessed?
Well, I think, I echo what Richard said. In the limited receiverships that we have been a part of, we've been a part of probably, at least in the last year, almost half a dozen. The cost savings and the ability to craft a budget, knowing how many hours we really are going to have to spend either on a weekly or monthly basis, is a lot easier than some of the traditional receiverships that we have right now, where it is myself or Ken or someone else on our team having to go run on out on site to a job site because we're the ones that are overseeing things, or handling, as Richard said, every single customer phone call, dealing with human resources. We have machines that go down. We're trying to work with the employees to get that back up and running. There's definitely a cost benefit to a limited receiver that I think also in a way gets the same benefit and results that perhaps a traditional one has as well.
Fantastic. All right, we were about out of time. I'm going to shoehorn in one more question. And so you've convinced the two of you have convinced me as a creditor that I need a limited receivership. How quickly can we get started? Tell me a little bit about the process of getting assigned, and then what, actually, let's do Richard. Tell us a little about, getting assigned. And then Matthew, I'm going to have you follow up with the time it takes when your boots are on the ground to find out, kind of start knowing what you know.
Well, okay, so we're beholden to the court system. So this is a big caveat. Depending on what county you're in, who your judge is, will depend the speed. Also, whether you're seeking the receiver through a contractual right in a mortgage security agreement, something of that nature, or you're trying to do it through a statute. In the contractual right, especially in a bank situation, if there's a default, you have the right to appoint the receiver. In the statutory method, you need to show that there's the potential for waste, mismanagement, fraud. You have to develop a case for why you want this extreme measure, because receivers are extreme. That extends, obviously, the process. You file your motion as quickly as you can. Usually file the complaint, and the motion is right behind it. Make sure you get everybody served. Maybe do it on an emergency if it's dire enough. But every court will generally allow them time to respond, no matter how short. So you're probably looking at, we've had them as quick as 30 days. I've taken as long as 120, depending on who your opponent is in the case and how much he spells it out. But it could be relatively quick if the court sees a real issue. If you can point to a fraud or expenditures that are outside the normal course of a business, that usually accelerates the process.
Great. And Matthew, tell us a little about once Richard has gotten you in, how long before I get to find out what I got?
Normally, especially a standard operating procedure for us at Newpoint is to be on site, deploying resources within a 24-hour window of being appointed. Usually within that, first week, I call it, in bankruptcy, you call it first day motions, and in a receivership or limited receivership, we call it, very similar. So those first day action items, those first week action items of gaining control of all the cash, the books and records, whether electronically or not, understanding, looking at the scope of what the receivership deliverables are. Usually we can get that under control as long as we have, cooperation within a few days. Sometimes when there's not that level of cooperation, usually you're going back to court, getting a motion to compel, rule to show cause in those situations, which is why it is extremely important to have counsel like Richard, who understands receiverships and understands the need for expediency, and knows how to explain to judges who might not be as well versed in receiverships or limited receiverships, the purpose, the reason why we need to get this moving. So normally within usually a week or a couple of weeks, you can get your hands around everything and get a sense of where things are going. And really, it's all about putting a stop to anything that was growing legs and walking out the door. So once you have control of the cash, you have the books and records, you're able to stop some of the unnecessary outflow of cash for the receivership.
Great. Thank you, guys. All right. We're running out of time, but I've been told by the powers that be that I could throw one more question at you guys. And so I'm going to throw this one at just very simply. How is the receiver compensated? What is the authority and process? Am I skimming off the checks, or do I have to go back to the judge with a bill every month? How does how's this work?
Which side do you want to take?
I will tell you from the limited receivership standpoint, the receiver gets paid first from the the proceeds, the cash that is in the business. And if there is not enough cash to pay the receiver, usually your petitioning party is the one that has to come out of pocket, or there's an agreement like Richard and I had in another case, perhaps, where there is either a settlement on who pays it or a split. But you are always, as a receiver or a limited receiver, petitioning the court in your receiver reports, which are usually filed on a either a 60-day or quarterly basis, permission to use the cash from the business to pay his or her fees.
Richard, any final points?
Just if there's no money, like Matt stated, especially in a shareholder dispute, the parties are going to wrestle as to how that's done. And usually the court is the tiebreaker. The court will make a decision. And as Matt said, they're usually going to point to the person that wants the receiver because nothing's really been proven at that point. It's all, allegations and the like. When it's a lender situation, generally it's the lender that's paying the bill. And he's usually the petitioner, or almost he is the petitioner. So
yeah, we're always going to the court to get, our cash budgets approved, any spending that's outside the budget as a safety precaution. And as we call it the break the glass measure, getting a court approval and an order executed and signed that authorizes you to do something, that always to me is, that's the insurance policy you need as a receiver.
Just real quick, in every receiver order, there's generally a cap on what the limited receiver can spend without court approval. So, there's usually a number, and depending on the size of the case and what the situation is, the judge will set that number.
That's absolutely right.
Well, gentlemen, we have exhausted our time, and to our audience, thank you very much. We didn't get to answer all the questions, but I'm going to turn it over to our supporting staff to help out here.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Ken, Richard, and Matthew, for lending your expertise today. And thank you to everyone who was able to log in and participate. As promised, we will email out a tip sheet on limited receivership with a lot of the key information that was discussed this afternoon. And Newpoint Advisors are one of the only turnaround experts that specialize in this for small distressed businesses and offer the fixed fee pricing and timelines in a collaborative approach. So if you do have any questions about exploring a limited receivership, please do reach out to Ken or Matthew. Both of their emails are here on the screen. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time today. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.